Hello, welcome to everybody who has joined us. Thank you very much for coming along. You are here tonight with Autistic Parents UK and the marvellous Kieran Rose, and we are exploring autistic coping mechanisms tonight. We tend to find it easiest, if it's okay with all of you, if you can keep cameras off, please, and do try and keep microphones muted. We've had a few, haven't we, where microphones get unmuted and then you just get weird bits of other people's conversations in the background, which is a little bit distracting. And it's only us tonight. I haven't got like another secret admin, so I'd have to stop talking and look at things. I'm not very good at doing two things at once. But if you have got any questions, any comments, anything that you want to join in, please do contribute on the chat. I will pause sporadically and have a little look through the chat, so we will keep up with your contributions. Hopefully that's okay. That is the same way that we normally run it, so hopefully that is okay. So if we start off, I was just saying, for those of you who just joined us, I was just saying that we've chosen a slightly darker kind of topic tonight, so that we have no quibbles about the fact that this is probably going to be perhaps a little bit darker than some of our other conversations. So trigger warnings at the top, I suppose, probably everything, because
No, I
we're
was
going to
just
be
about to
talking
say that.
all the things.
Just in case, everything.
We're going to be talking about autistic trauma. Do look after yourselves. If you need to come out, come out. Anybody who's bought a ticket will get the recording automatically. So if you need to step away for a minute and pay attention to the time and make sure you just skip that bit when you come back, do feel free to do that. As I say, look after yourselves. We'll try not to go super duper dark, but the topic's what it is. We're exploring autistic coping mechanisms.
No promises.
Yeah. Um, it only makes me think silly things, Kieran. I'm trying to be serious now. And as soon as we start saying that, my brain just goes straight to poo. So we're just not going to do that. But I did think that we could start off by having a little bit of a talk around maybe some of the more common, probably unhealthy coping mechanisms that
Mm.
we see uh, within the autistic community, within autistic populations. What do you think you come across most often?
Um, Probably when we get into things like harmful stim territory.
Yeah.
So that might be if you're a skin picker, for example, when that's
Yes.
to an extreme, things like head banging, stuff like that. But also there's the kind of, there's so many different ways you could go with this because like eating, there can be lots of coping strategies around kind of eating, either controlling food or eating too much food. There could be other reasons for that, but they're kind of the things that we tend to see. But also, the big one through it is the way that your kind of mask presents as well,
Yeah.
because quite often that can get us into quite some problematic situations, and then you have to do more problematic things to get yourself out of those situations if you can. So I think, yeah, that's kind of where my brain tends to go when I kind of think of that question, because it depends on your definition of coping as well, because I think for many of us who don't have much autonomy or agency, that idea of coping is actually surviving, and that's
Yes.
they're not quite the same thing.
Okay. Oh, I like that. And yes, that would probably be what I was thinking around that with coping, is coping with being alive
Yeah,
rather than actual coping and um, managing, keeping yourself to a level of actual healthy well-being.
yeah,
And yeah, for a lot of those, that isn't going to be what it's around, is it? It is just managing to get through another day.
yeah,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah. And we can see that extra layer of complexity as well, as is so often the case with topics that we touch on in these lives, that for autistic parents, it brings in another layer where it might not just be that those are unhealthy stims or unhealthy habits or even addictions that you've picked up along the way that you're then potentially trying to hide from the general people in your life, but
Yeah.
also it can make it extra complicated if you have small people who live in your house and
Hmm.
may well be asking you around those unhealthy areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. It's that as a parent, it adds a whole obviously extra layer of stress.
Yeah,
Because if you are dysregulated, distressed, if you're having to deal with lots of stressful situations, having a most of us as autistic parents tend to have autistic children. Funny that, isn't it?
yes, yes,
Which then, if you're dealing with things like schools and stuff like that, then that adds so much more tension into the mix and puts extra pressure on you because it's not only about coping for yourself, it's about then coping with supporting the family and making sure that the children are okay and taking on their stress for them. And so it all kind of, it's this cyclical thing that just keeps coming back at you and
yes,
adds a bigger and bigger and bigger load depending on your context.
yes. Yeah, I think what I've seen as well, probably to certain degrees within my own network and within the wider autistic community, is that because we have this generational, that it tends to be autistic people who have more autistic people, certainly neurodivergent people who have more neurodivergent people
Hmm.
have slightly different flavours between generations, but that actually those unhealthy coping mechanisms, managing mechanisms, survival strategies can be generational.
Yeah.
Certainly things like addiction, we
Hmm.
can really see that be generational, can't we? That it's a learned behaviour as much as anything else that certain adults within your life, the only way they manage to get from one day to the other is through alcohol, through drugs, through smoking, whatever it is. And so all you learn as you grow up is the only way to manage with the general day-to-day overwhelm, stress of life is drugs or alcohol or whatever it is that you've observed.
And I think it takes on different flavors as well. Because I was actually thinking about this earlier in terms of those of us who are maybe slightly more significantly ADHD than others. um, there can be as you kind of reflect back on your life, you see different levels of impulsiveness in relation to stress. So for me, when I was much younger, when I was a kind of teen, early 20s, it was definitely drugs and alcohol. But then moving on as I've taken on more responsibilities, had children and things like that, and have managed to kind of, put those things to one side, it comes out in things like spending and things like that as well. And
Right.
not necessarily big things, but maybe lots of little things like, like silly games you have on your phone and things. And it's just like, oh, I'll just spend £5 and then I'll just spend another five. And then it just, it just
Yes.
escalates very, very quickly. And I think
Yes.
a lot of that is stress coming out and dealing with stress that you can't have any control over. You can't change the stress that's coming at you, or it's a long-term thing. So there's nothing in that instance that you can do about it. But then it's looking for that bit of dopamine rush or something that just pulls your attention away from it for a second. And so you don't have to think about
Yes.
it and you feel a little bit better within yourself, and then 10 minutes later you feel terrible because you've done something you shouldn't have done. But that's kind of how
Yeah.
it manifests.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I really see that in myself as well, that dopamine thing. And I find that what I've had to do is kind of change some of my internal monologue
Mm-hmm.
because what I find really increases my dopamine is doing something that my internal monologue tells me is naughty.
Mm.
So if I know that it's a really bad idea to just buy another pair of dungarees, because really we've got sensible things that we should be spending that money on, plus I have an entire wardrobe full of dungarees. But as you say, I'm really, really stressed and it's late at night and I'm quite overwhelmed. And my brain says, oh, that would be ever so naughty to just get that latest design from one of the brands that you like. I read that as that is a massive dopamine hit and increasing amount, right? So you get the
Yeah.
dopamine hit when you buy it, but then you also get a bit of dopamine hit from hiding it from your family members,
Mm-hmm.
and you get the dopamine hit when it comes in the post, and you get the dopamine hit, thinking how you're going to explain it. And actually, my family are great, and it isn't actually a big thing. But just it's the inside stuff, not the outside
It's the
stuff. That
negative dopamine hit, isn't it? It's the and
yeah,
then it's how do you replace that negative hit with maybe something more constructive or positive?
yes, yes, yeah. So if we're thinking about those unhealthy, I don't know whether to call them coping mechanisms or survival strategies, or a
Mm.
bit of both. Um, do you think that they tend to, does it mostly about that dopamine side, or do you think some of it is around replacing sensory stimulus or giving us a particularly sensory, because I'm thinking of skin picking,
Yeah,
but also I suppose substance abuse as well, of maybe more the sensory side than the dopamine side? What do you think?
I think I think it very much depends on what you do and how you do it. I think if there's things that do have that kind of, I mean, the dopamine hit is a sensory thing.
Yeah,
It's a sensory
sure.
process that you're kind of experiencing, and the same with skin picking and things like that. And if you pick at your nails or whatever, pull at your hair or pluck your eyebrow, whatever it is that you do, those things are kind of sensory processes. Where was I going? I was going somewhere with this. Because I was thinking I had an alternate in my head.
Okay.
Sits alongside those things and isn't quite the same. It's just completely jump. I've got a chest infection at the moment, so I'm like doped up to the eyeballs. There's another thing. Well, what was I going to go? What was I going to say? Say something else, and it will come back to me, Ruth.
Okay.
No pressure.
So what were we talking about? So we were talking about whether it was more of a dopamine side or whether it was more of a sensory replacement. Were you thinking more around the sensory replacement side?
No, I was thinking of a third option actually, and it's just
Okay.
it
And
gone
it
out of my
still
head.
just
But
escaped
yeah,
you. I
you
didn't
know,
know if we could rewind.
let's roll with that for a second because there is a sensory component to that dopamine hit. Whatever it is that you're
Yes,
doing, you're getting, even if you are skin picking, there's a dopamine aspect to that. If you're
sure.
plucking your hair, there's a dopamine aspect to that. And if you are someone who rocks or bangs your head, there's a dopamine aspect to that. You're getting
Yeah.
something from it, and it will send all sorts of dopamine, cortisol into your body, and all of that excitement kind of thing, and all those chemicals floating around inside you, which ironically are feeding your dysregulation.
Yeah.
Also, I think there's a bit of a self fulfilling prophecy with that as well. It's kind of I think because of a lot of the internalized narratives that we do carry around kind of, that self stigma and that internalized ableism, I think there's an aspect of our unconscious which is like, you deserve to feel bad.
Oh, yeah.
And then that goes round in cycles as well. So you're seeking something which is making you feel better, even though you know it's not making you feel better. And then the outcome is that you feel really bad and guilty about it. And then you can then blame yourself and beat yourself up. And then it just keeps going round and round like that as well.
Yes.
But where was I gonna go? This really bugging me because it was really good.
If I change that, because that's made me think of something, and we can
Go
always
on.
come back to it.
Of course.
That's made me think about people that grow up in highly stressful environments
Mm.
and with traumatized childhoods tend to seek out those kind of trauma bonds
Yeah.
and the same kind of relationships based around confrontation and
Mhm.
conflict that they had, because our bodies actually get used to and seek out a level of kind of stress. And so it's similar kind of thing, that if you are, yeah, if that's your internal monologue based around that level of self-hatred and stress, then you're also seeking out reasons to hate yourself and be
Yeah.
stressed. And all of those things can help you hate yourself more. Mm.
That's the power of stigma. It's
Yeah,
a really big thing, and stigma ultimately doesn't have its roots in you. It has its roots externally. It's
yeah,
other people's perceptions of you and the messages that you get, whether they're implicit or whether they're very, very open, or whether they're intentional or whether they're unintentional as well. Because many of those negative messages that we get do come from a place of it's not intentional that people say things or do things that make us feel bad about ourselves, but they do.
mm,
Mostly it's well-intentioned people not knowing the harm that they cause when they say things. So yeah, so
yeah,
that internal narrative really kind of feeds this. Um, but stress is everywhere. And I think when
Yeah,
you are a marginalized person on any level, some people are more marginalized than others depending on the kind of the intersectionalities of their experiences and things like that. But if you're marginalized on any level, that also means that you are undermined, you are invalidated. So that means that you're going to feel disconnected and discombobulated, and so it's all this horrible negative stuff that's floating around you. So then when we do come up with a term like coping, we have to really think about what that means,
yeah,
because coping for some people is doing okay, like we said earlier, but coping for other people might mean not drowning. And those
yeah,
two states are very, very, very different.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Or I mean, when you brought that up at the beginning, it actually just made me think of people who were on the borderline, constantly on the borderline of do I choose to stay alive today
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah.
And that some of those strategies are more around that, aren't they? Of
Yeah.
this is the only way I can get through to tomorrow, literally how I can get through to tomorrow. Yeah, and you're
Yeah.
right. Societal attitudes around a lot of what we've touched upon. It's just, um, I think it's like so much of what we talk about. It's just that correct information is really hard to find, and most of what is out there is not correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
When we say most, we mean 99.9% of it,
Like by
which is
far, isn't it?
it's
I mean,
terrifying.
I'm thinking of people who I've known and loved who have had, really, really troublesome ways that they get through the day.
Mm,
I've known people with really problematic addiction issues, also people with um, very high levels of self harm, like self harm that needs urgent medical care. And that actually the attitudes of the healthcare professionals to both of those things doesn't tend to be useful.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely
It,
not.
it tends to be more of that perpetuating negativity that we were talking about there, that this is your own fault and
Yeah.
you're wasting everybody's time and you're wasting medical resources because you've done this to yourself and
You're
pretty much how
choosing to
dare
do
you.
this. Yeah. Yeah. And then it's very much, and again, that's perception. That's a real perception, but we live societally within a narrative of, you have to exist in certain ways, do things in certain ways. Um, and when it's easier for you to exist within society like that, when your needs are ultimately being met more than other people's needs are, or you don't face the barriers that other people do face, then it's very easy to create a dynamic whereby, well, I'm okay, so you could choose to be okay as well.
Yeah,
Understanding there's this is why the double empathy problem is so important. This recognition that actually it's really hard for anybody to understand anybody else's experience unless they've lived that themselves. Um,
yes,
so there's an empathy gap between all human beings and all groups, interpersonally and on a larger scale. So the more we kind of can sit in that gap, the more we're going to be able to kind of recognize other people's needs. And unfortunately, this is where privilege comes in. Privilege is
yeah,
a very real thing. And it's not about how much money you have or whether you work or whether you don't. It's about actually privilege is about the things that we don't see because we don't recognize them as barriers for ourselves because they
yeah,
don't exist as barriers. That means we don't see other people's barriers because we don't have to think about those things. So
mm,
so sitting within that empathy gap is kind of key to understanding that social dynamic and overcoming that social dynamic and
yeah,
bringing a more kind of egalitarian kind of state. But at the minute, we don't exist in a society like that. We exist in a
yeah,
society where people walk around inside their own heads and never leave them, never recognize their privilege, and therefore impact on other people in different ways, or the systems they create impact on other people in different ways, and never see that. And then the
yeah.
marginalized people are expected to cope.
Yeah, absolutely. We've also, I've been thinking about this more and more recently that we've managed, and this isn't actually even globally, this is the West.
Mm,
We've managed to create incredibly isolated individuals that we just don't have community anymore.
yeah.
We don't have neighbours, our families may not be close, and obviously for marginalised identities, and I know it's really common in the autistic community to
Mhm.
not be close to your family in lots of different ways, maybe not just physically, but also to have lots of other barriers to family.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of created this situation where actually people are expected to cope by themselves, and certainly households are expected to just cope by themselves
Yeah.
with with almost nothing to reach out to, is there?
Yeah. And I think because part of that stems from what happened politically in the kind of late 70s through the 80s and 90s in terms of
Yeah,
neoliberalism,
yeah,
which is an extreme capitalist ideology where it's like every man for themselves, basically.
yeah,
And
yeah,
we had this culture particularly in the UK and in North America, this culture of very hierarchical culture of power and money equaled status. So therefore, people climbed over each other in order to kind of get to the top of the money tree, as the politicians like to call it. So neoliberalism has played a massive part
yeah,
in that fracturing of community because it
yeah,
effectively what was being taught at the time and still to a degree is now is that you look after yourself and you
yeah,
don't care about anybody else. Like charity is not a real thing. Like that real mantra of charity begins at
yeah,
home, but on steroids. Like
yeah,
so you have to look after yourself in order to be able to help other people. But this is about getting yourself to a position of power before you, and then you look down and
yeah,
forget other people are there. Or you
yeah,
suck more out of them. So that's really that culture I think that was created there. And then alongside that, particularly outside of kind of the South and very much like London, you had the fracturing of lots of different micro communities in terms of
yeah,
the mining communities and villages and farming communities have been fractured, fishing communities have been fractured. So all the
yeah,
things that people built community around have all gone or
yes,
have become so tiny that they're just people just clinging on now, and it's created this loss of identity, I think, for
yeah,
groups of people. And it's, I mean, like where I don't know my neighbours at all where I live. I've lived in this
no,
house where I've lived for like 20 odd years, nearly 20 years. Don't really know my neighbours at all. And yet I live in a small town where everybody used to know everybody else.
yeah,
And now it's just all strangers. It's,
yeah. Yeah, we've lived here for a year now, and I don't know our neighbours. To be fair, when we moved here, I did explicitly say I would really like to never know my neighbours because the neighbours that we lived next door to in our old house were like awful human beings. So I was like, if they never ever know our names, I'd actually be really pleased because that means they don't know who to complain to letting agents about.
yeah.
So that would be great. I'm going to come to the comments because we've done our usual and it's gone off
Just
a little
ignored
bit.
everybody else.
Um,
Sorry,
so
everybody.
Eliza put in, skin picking is so hard to overcome. I really want to stop, but a part of me doesn't want to stop because I enjoy it. Yeah, yeah.
And why
I've bitten
should you
my,
stop something you enjoy? That's a really important point. So it's
yeah,
I think as long as it's safe, it's okay. It's when it gets to the point where you might start getting infections or you
yes.
cause damage to yourself, which is, might need medical treatment and things like that. That's when it gets into the realms of harmful stimming. But skin picking on its own is fine. It's great when you
It
get
can be,
sunburn. I don't condone getting sunburn, but getting sunburn is great for the post bit where you can start peeling all the skin off yourself.
oh, right. Oh, that's the opposite sensory for me. Oh, can't go with that. Although, having said that, I do love a peely face mask. I do love a
There
peely
you go.
face mask. That's
I
very
used to
nice.
put,
But my actual skin,
the PVA glue that they use in primary schools. I used to coat my hands in it and peel it off.
I that should have. I swear that should be a diagnostic question. Did you used to any glue project purposely paint the back of your hand and then spend the rest of the afternoon carefully peeling all the glue off your hand?
Do you know
I
the
know.
irony with that? I don't do like paint muck and like paints and things like that. Any messy play I do not do, but I would
No,
literally cover myself in PVA glue and peel it off.
you got to get yourself some face masks because that's what I do. I put the face mask on and then I cover it all on my hands that I just peel off for fun. Um, what I was going to say was there can be a social aspect that if you are doing skin picking on your face, then you are potentially inviting comments from whether
Mm-hmm.
that's people that you love who are trying to make helpful comments or people that you don't who are also potentially trying to offer you solutions or asking you questions, and that can be difficult. Lisa has put in, I've bitten my nails in the skin surrounding for as long as I can remember after making them bleed and sore. Never thought about it as a stim before. Oh, that's really interesting,
Mm.
Lisa. Yes, definitely a stim. And yeah, Hannah putting in, been thinking about community recently too, and the total lack of it. Completely agree with the point about isolation. If I didn't have my husband and son, I'd feel incredibly alone. I especially feel isolated at work because people just don't understand autism. Yeah. Skin picking's a problem because I get bold bits on your scalp, right? Used to rip out bits of books and eat them. I
Oh, that's
used to eat
sacrilege. No,
paper.
no, no. Not the books. Leave the books
And
alone.
I didn't rip up books because I come from a household of readers.
Mm.
But I used to eat paper. That's was quite, again, I don't think I could cope with it these days, but when I was a kid it was quite a pleasant sensory
Mm.
experience. Wet paper in my mouth. I had to turn off the radio the other day because they were talking about chewing gum and how long you could chew gum for, and they were talking about chewing gum for over
Oh,
24 hours, and I had to just turn the radio
no,
off.
no, no, no. Because not only does it lose its flavor, it goes a weird cold as well. Like the
Right.
temperature changes with it. It's
And it,
bizarre.
it feels like blue tack and
No,
just,
no, no, no. If I could jump back to Lisa's comment about thinking
please.
about not thinking about it as a stim. So something that might help with that is we often think about stims as kind of big physical things.
Yeah,
Stimming can look like lots of things. You can stim internally,
yeah,
like through humming inside your head, singing songs inside your
yeah,
head, repetitive noises, those kind of things. Um, and it's not. Lots of people kind of have a bit of a superficial thinking about stimming that it's all about kind of regulation, and it isn't always about regulate. It's also about communication. Stimming is a form of emoting. So how you stim can be an external expression of what's going on inside you. So if you're stimming in ways which might cause damage to your body, then I would suggest that maybe you aren't very happy, or you've got stuff going on that is stressing you out and making you uncomfortable or dysregulated. So actually it's a communication, and
mm,
if we can help other people understand that, then that can, like our loved ones and things like that can really help, because many of us are alexithymic and struggle to kind of pinpoint exactly what we're feeling at any given
yeah,
moment, or become
yeah,
overwhelmed by what we're feeling. So actually it can be helpful for our partners, husbands, wives, children, parents, whatever, to help them recognize actually that there might be something within us that isn't very happy or comfortable at that moment.
yes, yes, yeah, absolutely. That can be a really positive communication, can't it?
Yeah.
Of if you notice this about me, then it probably means there's something else going on. Yeah,
And usually
yeah,
you find with things like skin picking, when you are distressed, that intensifies. That's not to say people don't skin pick when they're not stressed, because that does happen, but the kind of extremeness of it, and then where it gets to the point where you actually, you bleed or things like that,
yeah,
that's usually coming when you're quite distressed, even if it's not an obvious distress.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's kind of similar to self-harm, which we touched upon a little bit there. But I know that that is much more common in the autistic community than outside of it. And again, just that because I was historically a self-harmer, and for me, it was like a sensory interruption. That
Mm-hmm.
if I felt myself in that really unpleasant space where you know you're going into a meltdown, but you're not in a safe space to have a meltdown,
Yeah.
and you're just in that hideous, like desperately trying to hold yourself together while your whole internal self is just a giant scream. The only thing I could do is self harm, and it
Yeah.
would just give me a focal point where then I could kind of come back into consciousness as such, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose. Um, uh, but again, that is difficult on lots of different levels, isn't it? And definitely not a happy strategy or coping mechanism. Or
No, but it is a release, and sometimes
yeah,
is better than the alternative, which might be something far more drastic. And
yeah,
that's what I was going to say there, because there's a kind of digging into this. Again, this is something that's often spoken about very superficially in terms of things like harmful stims and self-harming. often from an outside perspective, they can look shocking and, like
Yeah,
cutting, shocking.
yeah,
But there is a difference between those things and self-injurious behavior. So self-injurious behavior is where you are out of control and drastically hurting yourself. But
yes,
from an outside perspective, things like harmful stims and self-harm can look more drastic than they actually are. So
yes,
cutting isn't great, but it's not actually going to kill you unless you get blood poisoning, as long as you're clean. This is why the more recent narrative in terms of, I don't know what's like in other countries, but certainly in terms of the NHS and support with cutting is actually allow the person to do it, but make sure that they're using clean tools to do so,
yes,
so that it's controlled. And that's the thing. It's like with things like when autistic people melt down, or if they are people who are get distressed an awful lot, and melting down is a regular occurrence for them, then usually what you see, what's described as kind of all that self-harm or self-injurious behavior, is actually things like head banging or hitting yourself, but it's the palms of your hand against the temple of
right,
your head, or punching yourself in the soft parts of your body. So you're
yes,
not going to cause, there's an element of unconscious control there still.
yes, yes,
So you're getting the sensory input, which is a big, that dopamine rush that we were talking about earlier, and the sensory input from that. But you're not at the point where you're going to cause long-term damage to your body. So
yes,
it's not quite self-injurious behavior, but from the outside, that's when people start looking at you and start jumping in and restraining you.
right,
When in actual fact, you're distressed and you're getting an input that you actually need at that moment. So,
yes.
so yeah,
That's a really important point.
it
Yeah.
is.
I think especially if we're thinking of either communicating with our loved ones, or if we're thinking about caring for the other autistic people in our lives and the things that we might observe them doing, is thinking about that of how much are they actually hurting themselves, how much danger are they actually in
Yeah.
right now in this moment. Yeah, I did want to mention. Oh, I had this email through, but I thought it was such a nice thing to mention. There's a company called Safe Cuts, and they sell little packets that look like first aid kits, but they're
Hmm.
specifically for self harmers, particularly who like to cut. And it's got sterile wipes, steri strips, but it's also got things like pens, because some people find that if they draw the red on them, they don't actually need to break
Yeah.
their skin.
Sometimes
Um,
it's about the ritual more than it is
yeah,
about the doing of it. It's the
yeah,
process and the feeling that you get from it, or the visual impression that you get from it is. So it's so important not to look at these things superficially, because
yeah,
we miss so much. And actually digging into it and explore it, we get so it's a taboo, isn't it? We don't
yes,
we get trapped within our fear of risk, and
yeah,
professional services get trapped within fear of risk all the time. But actually, if we start exploring these things, and we can figure out the whys of things happening, what the person's getting from that thing, what we can then do safely to help them still get that input, but they don't cause damage to themselves, or accidentally go too far, and things like that. And it's so I fully condone an organization like that that's putting something together like that, because
yeah.
that makes it safe.
That's it. And it can open the conversation up as well. That either if it's something you do yourself or it's something that a loved one is doing, then something like that is a way to talk to the other people you care about around. And this is how we're going to try and keep it as healthy as possible for right now.
Mm.
I'm going to come back to the comments, and
Mhm.
then I think if we move on kind of more along that line around maybe what we could do instead.
Sure.
Oh, I sing songs on repeat in my head always. Yeah, me too, Lisa. I have a lot of and I get a single line. I get echolalia, internal echolalia a lot. Yeah, I do this too. It drives me crazy. Yeah, I don't like to listen to the radio because the songs get stuck in your head. Yeah, the best ones is when you realise that your internal echolalia is wrong and that the lyrics for the song are entirely different, and you've been internalizing the wrong lyrics potentially for years.
Yeah,
Um,
but when I do that, the lines that I come up with are much better than the ones in the song. So, and then I do that, but a lot of like music is a big thing for me, and
yeah,
I think we've talked about this before, that like I irritate people because they say things. It reminds me of a song, and then I sing it to them.
yeah,
Like life is a musical for me, and it's so often like I then get caught in a loop where I'll have the same tune going, but then I'll start singing completely different lines and everything gets matched into that. It's, yeah, I'm weird.
No, 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 no. I think we'll all agree.
We're
Probably,
weird
we'll
together.
probably realise as time goes on that everybody that writes musicals is just autistic. I definitely bite my nails, etc. More when stressed. Often don't realise I'm doing it till it hurts.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I've always done. Was a way of shocking my system. Yes, I'd say that,
Mhm.
Victoria. Yeah, I think that that's and a way of breaking the negative thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A way of kind of ending the cycle. Yeah. I'm also burnt out now, so it's happening more. Yeah, which is really, really common,
Mhm.
Emma. And for some of us, that can be one of those indicators both for ourselves and for the people around us that we're getting into burnout is increasing stims, but also potentially increasing stims that are have the potential to be harmful or more drastic or yeah. Oh, this is interesting. Emma's saying I tried to ask a GP for help as I know I'm in burnout and suspect PTSD, but the social prescriber just sent info on breathing techniques, sleep hygiene, and CBT techniques. How do I actually get them to listen and take it seriously? There's a second bit to that. I asked my daughter's social prescriber to send the GP Kieran's piece about burnout on Autistic Advocate, but I don't think they actually read it. Yeah, sometimes it's worth conserving your energy. They may never understand and can make matters worse. Shall we? Let's address that then. Actually, I can see you've written a bit more, Emma, and we're going to come to that in a minute. But let's address that where that is, because that was actually where I was hoping to steer us.
Okay. Perfect place to start,
Um,
isn't it?
of what can we do when we recognise it in ourselves?
Yeah. So, what I would say there, Emma, is in terms of, as you well know, what they've given you isn't very useful because that's the conflation between burnout and poor mental health. Where they're actually, although there is an overlap between those two things, they are two distinct things as well that occur separately to each other. Burnout is not a mental health issue. Burnout is a physical health issue and a cognitive issue. Um, that impacts on your physiology, your biology, the way you think, all of those kind of things. As you well know, it's like existing within treacle. Everything slows down. You get kind of physical ailments more. It's hard to think. You get brain fog, and the world, your vision gets narrow. All of those things that are commonly in burnout, which aren't a part of depression, but from an external narrative, from that kind of medical narrative, burnout isn't a thing. Burnout doesn't exist. It's only very, very recently started to be kind of looked at very high circles amongst kind of, the Royal College of Psychiatry are looking at it between in autistic adults, not children, just adults, because, they're two separate existences. Two different types of human. So yeah, so it's not well known. So when you go to the GP and you start talking about, well, I'm feeling sluggish and lethargic and I've got brain fog, their first thought is, oh, you must be stressed. Oh, you must have mental health. You must have depression. So that's when they start giving you things like CBT, because CBT is the gold standard treatment for depression according to the NHS, although I would argue with the evidence base for that. And in CBT, one of the main processes that they use is something called activation. So when you are depressed, doing things helps you not be depressed. Doesn't take away the stresses that you have in your life, but it can distract you from those things. That's the ideology of it. It's about kind of giving yourself positive and constructive things to do. When you're burnt out, activation places more demand on you. So you become more burnt out because it's more pressure on you to do something which you can't necessarily do. So therefore, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that then you end up in a poor state of mental health because you can't do the things that are supposed to fix you.
Mm.
How do we kind of break that cycle? There's a long term thing that's going on, which hopefully is going to break that cycle in about the next 100 years or so, which is getting medical practitioners to understand that this is a thing. And I'm not being sarcastic when I say 100 years, because we're talking about stuff that's going to take a long decades and decades and decades to become embedded. But secondary to that is, unfortunately, don't look to the NHS for solutions. And that's a big thing to say, but so many of the services within the NHS do not understand autistic experience at all, have no clue what they're doing, and actually looking to, and I say this to parents all the time who are, whose children are struggling, Don't look to CAMS for solutions. Don't look to children and young people services for solutions. Pockets of CAMS and CYP are doing some good stuff, but for the most part, they're not well informed enough or have the ability to actually meet the needs of your children. So this is where we get into kind of privileged territory, because you say, well, if you can't go to the NHS, what can you do?
Mm.
So this is where, if you have the privilege, a private therapist who's in for neurodivergent kind of neuro-inclusive, or a neurodivergent therapist will understand things a little bit better for you, will understand the context of things that are going on for you. And not everybody has the privilege to do that. So then we have a kind of a drop down, which isn't as great, but look into the community for peer support. So finding the people like AP UK provide peer support. So at the very least, it's getting a level of validation as to how you're feeling. Someone else who knows what you're going through might be going through or have gone it through it themselves more often. So someone who maybe is a few steps ahead of you in terms of their experience and their understanding of this. So that then gives you the opportunity to kind of have someone's lead to follow in a way. And that place of validation is very, very unlikely to come from the NHS, unfortunately.
Mm. The other thing we find in peer support is, and I am biased because I deliver peer support for AB UK, but the other thing that we find is actual useful tools that other autistic people who've been in burnout can say, while I was in burnout, or while I was coming out of burnout, or what I do right now while I'm also in the middle of burnout, is I do X or Y, was it? I know one of the conversations we had recently in one of our small groups was accessing AI.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of people who were saying that it's so useful for executive functioning tasks to be able to say, I have got £75 and 25p, and I need to feed two people for 5 days, and these are our food allergies. And the AI can just go, here's a shopping list.
Yeah.
Do you know? So it can be, which you probably wouldn't get from a GP, but is actually useful rather than just change your internal narrative and your body will stop being totally exhausted,
Yeah,
which
because
doesn't
that's not
quite work
that's not
that
going to
way.
happen, and it's whole thing with burnout is to remove the demand as much as you can from yourself, and have supportive people around you who can help remove that demand as well if you're lucky enough to have that. So that's like a perfect example of how you can, as a parent, how you can take that pressure of yourself just a little bit. One
Yeah,
less thing to think about is huge. So if you could get two less things to think about or three less things to think about, then all of a sudden you're into kind of game changing territory. And the problem is that so many of us grow up to be so disempowered with that expectation on us to fulfill the needs of everyone and everything going on around us without considering the impact of that on ourselves or knowing what the impact is, but still pushing through anyway. Because masking and things are still happening during burnout, but it's actually the I have to push through. I have to push through. It's that narrative of, and then you beat yourself up for not being good enough and not being able to fulfill everybody else's needs and so on and so forth. So the more demand you can remove from yourself, the more likely it is that you're going to exit burnout that bit quicker, or at least get to a level where you can cope, where you're not trying not to drown, but you've crawled up on land and you're taking a breather for 10 minutes before you have to get up and start going again. So it's, yeah, that demand is key to all of that. But also within that as well is there are things that we can do, even if we can't remove that demand for us from ourselves. Things like, well, maybe there, if you can have an opportunity while you're feeling like this to think about, well, actually, what's impacting me negatively in terms of like the sensory stuff that's going on, because everything is much more exacerbated during burnout. So actually, things become easier to identify because they're bigger.
yeah,
Things like bright lights and things. If lights are giving you a headache while you're in burnout, they're also probably giving you a slightly less big headache when you're not in burnout, and
yeah,
things like that. So it's a way of kind of telling you, it's your body's way of telling you that what was going on before wasn't right, and it was having a massive negative impact on you. And it's you can reframe it, which is a hard thing to do, but you can while you're in it, but you can reframe it as a learning experience and
mm,
actually start looking at, what do I need to change, because what was going on, if I go back to what I was doing before, which I probably wouldn't be able to do, but if I could, it's just going to happen again, and it's probably going to happen worse. So we need to make changes.
Mm. I love that actually. I've never thought of it that way, of reframing your experience of burnout as yourself telling yourself exactly what it is that you were struggling with before. One of the first thing that goes for me is my executive functioning.
Yeah.
That it basically vanishes, and I don't have any, and I can't plan anything, and I can't do more than the one immediate task that I'm doing right now. And any, what are we going to have for dinner tonight? What bills do you need to pay? No idea. And it is because I find it very taxing day to day. It's something that I feel like I have to stay on top of, but it's actually quite hard for my brain.
And for me, it's two things. It's my ability to sleep. That's one of the first thing that goes. Uh,
Right.
my ability to get to sleep. I find myself,
Yes.
doom scrolling until 3 o'clock in the morning and not even
Yes.
what I've been doing, and that's a huge red flag for me. But the other thing is my speech. My
Right.
ability to make coherent sentences just goes, and I don't
Yeah.
don't speak much which is like always makes people laugh when I say this. I don't talk much. Yes, Kieran, who's just hyperverbal at you for 3 hours, but I don't actually talk that much. So when I do talk, my ability to string sentences together coherently, as we saw earlier, because my memory failed me, like pretty much immediately, which very rarely happens. So that's usually an indicator that something's going on with me, and I have a chest
Yes.
infection right now. So
Yeah,
so
you know what it is.
I know that something's not right if I get in a
Yeah.
speech like this, and then all of a sudden, hold on a minute, I can't think what I was going to say, and it's all
My
gone. And
brain's gone.
yeah, and then I
Yeah.
just start rambling. Um, and usually it's rambling incoherently as well. So if I'm doing that tonight, I apologize.
You're definitely being fab. I can see that they're 34 messages, so I'm going to come to those in 1 second. Yes, speech is another thing for me. And this was quite new. I don't remember it ever happening before, but in COVID, during lockdown, I got the one of the most burnt out I've ever been. I think probably the most burnt out was after my first son was born, but I was really bad in COVID. And I had several times where I lost speech entirely, which hadn't happened to me before. I do talk a lot all the time. And I developed this awful stutter that just got worse and worse and worse and worse. And then throughout the day, I'd just get to a point where I just like, can't do it anymore. Words not working. But my brain seems to have learned that now.
Yeah.
And now when I get tired, I get stuttery. So there's a few comments about your life doing a musical. Yes, definitely. Maybe when we've all got more spoons, we'll write an AP UK musical. I'll add it to the list of a million things that I want to do. Definitely have more physical elements, and it's really hard. Yeah. I'm signed off work with depression, anxiety, and I'm very bad at spotting the signs before it's too late. Yeah, and some of that is what Kieran touched upon earlier around alexithymia and kind of in with and overlapping with alexithymia is reduced interoception. So interoception is the sense that our bodies have of internal messages, whether we're hungry, whether we're thirsty, whether we're in pain, whether we're needing the loo, that kind of thing. That's all interoceptive messages. And there does seem to be a really big overlap between alexithymic people and people with very low interoception. So if you're struggling to access and hear those messages that your body's giving you, I mean, it's 80%, I think, isn't it, of autistic people who are alexithymic.
That's the statistic. I can't say the word
It's
statistic.
hard, isn't it? Because they're only recording white boys, but
Well, that's the thing. Anecdotally, I would argue it's all of us, because I don't like the spectrum terminology when it comes to talking about autistic people. But alexithymia does exist on a spectrum, on an individual spectrum and on a kind of group
yes.
spectrum, because it impacts different people differently and differently at different times as well.
Yeah,
So, ironically, if you're feeling more stressed, you're more likely to be alexithymic and not recognize that you're feeling stressed.
yeah, yeah.
Um, with the alexithymia and interoception link, another way of looking at that is that those people are the people who are more likely to get into monotropic flow states more easily as well. So, there is that dissociation kind of aspect to it as well, and where you can switch off from things and just hyper focus on stuff, and or you become semi dysregulated just all of the time because your brain can't actually latch onto anything, but it's trying to desperately.
Yeah, yeah, it's trying to deeply and desperately do one thing, and
Yeah.
you're making it do more than one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ewan has asked, what would you see as the distinction between burnout that your GP might expect to identify? I'm not sure about the GP, but what might the community expect to be the difference between burnout and depression, I
If
suppose?
you think about how depression is defined as a despondency, a lack of wanting to interact, with a wanting to withdraw. So like the common kind of picture that's kind of described as someone who struggles to get out of bed, literally cannot get out of bed.
Mm,
Um, that's not burnout. Burnout is where, yeah, you want to do the things, but you can't do them anymore. There are physical processes that stop you, mental processes that stop you, and it is like I said earlier, that kind of sense that you are just wading through treacle. Everything is harder, everything is heavier, everything is more sluggish, but you don't necessarily have that despondency. It's more of a confusion as to kind of, well, I could do all these things yesterday. Now why can't I do them now?
mm,
And literally, that's because your body's preventing you from doing them. So depression is up here in your head. I'm not saying it's made up, but I mean literally it manifests within your head and within your thinking. But burnout is something that you feel you do have. There are cognitive elements to it, but that is things like increased executive dysfunction, brain fog, stuff like that. So there's sometimes things that can go along with depression, but when you're not depressed, when you're not despondent, you might be struggling, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're extremely despondent. That's the kind of line between the two.
mm,
Said they can overlap because if you're burnt out and your needs aren't being met, then it's likely that you're going to end up in a depressed state. That's an absolute thing that's going to happen. But one burnout usually precedes the depressive kind of phase. And if
yeah,
you can get the right support while you're burnt out, I mean, if you can get the right support before you're burnt out, you won't become burnt out. If you get the right support while you're burnt out, it can prevent you from falling into the kind of the despondent kind of aspect of it and stuff. It's really fascinating. I'm doing some well, two separate bits of research at the moment. One with a group at UCL and one with a group at Durham. And one of them is looking at kind of, well, how is even depression defined? Because depression is defined from a normative perspective quite often.
mm,
And how we support people who are feeling depressed is very, very normative. So we're looking at kind of reframing that and then thinking about, well, our therapy is even talking about the same things as autistic people are talking about. And then the other side of that is the work with Durham we're doing is about suicide. Content warning that we gave you earlier covered everything. But again, talking about, well, how do we define what that means? What does suicidal ideation means? Because again, that's something that's come from a normative perspective. And
mm,
actually, as probably lots of autistic people here will recognize, as you go through your day-to-day activities, your mind goes in all sorts of directions and thinking about the different permutations of what might be happening and extrapolating all the time. And you might be walking down the street and jumps into your head the thought, what happens if I step out onto the road?
mm,
That's a common thing for an autistic person to think. What would happen if this knife slipped and cut my hand? Things like that. To thinking those things are normal, but for autistic people, but from a normative perspective, they're called intrusive thoughts, and then they lead to suicidal ideation. If you're thinking about stepping out on the road, you're a suicide risk. So, where actually it's a day to day normality for autistic people whose brains are
mm.
working in a little bit of a different way. So, how we're defining these things is really important to understand. And unfortunately, your common or garden GP isn't having that level of reflective thought because they're just working with the framework that they've been given, and
It's
that's
really,
the hard thing.
it's really interesting, isn't it, how we frame all these things? I saw I saw something a little while ago that they're now adding into. I think it's the latest DSM, but it might be the next DSM. And a mental ill health that they're categorizing, that basically you've been grieving for too long,
Oh, that's
that
from the
if
current
you're
one. Yeah.
right, that if you're still really sad that someone's died, and I think it's 6 months,
Yeah.
if you're still like really, really sad that a
It's a
loved one's
disorder.
died, 6 months afterwards, you actually have this specific mental ill health. And I do think it really brings that into sharp focus. Oh, we're making it all up as we go along. I need to remember that even when they're really embodied terms and there's something that we've heard and we feel comfortable with, and you could use it, and another member of the same society is going to go, I know what you're talking about. It's really important to remember that we made it all up.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All these things are constructs, and the way that we
Mm.
define things are constructs, and they mean on an interpersonal level, they mean different things for different people. But unfortunately, on a kind of a systems level, that means that multiple different systems might be using the same terminology but
Yeah,
talking about completely different things.
yeah,
And that's where it becomes also problematic. But we have societally boxed ourselves into this way of thinking that depression is one thing, even though
yeah,
we know rationally depression looks like 8 billion different things because there's eight
yeah,
billion different people, but we still box people into these narratives. And then, the people that can't fit into the boxes that we've created, well, we call them outliers, don't we? Or we create a new disorder, or yeah, we'll not get into the DSM because we'll be here for oh, about a year. But yeah, it's grief disorder is a perfect example of that, and that's in the DSM-5
this
TR.
one, right.
Um, and it is literally, if you grieve in a certain way for 6 months, like you said, then that's a disorder narrative. There's something fundamentally wrong with you, and it's not. It
Right. Like
out
I've had somebody fairly
the
close to me
difference.
die, and I mean, it's now been 13 years. And I still have, like not day to day, but I still think of them very often. I have dreams all the time that they're alive. I also have dreams all the time that everybody lied to me and everybody else knows that they're alive. Because that's how my brain works.
Shall I tell
But
you about my dream I had last night?
we'll have to come to the messages, but tell me about your dream first.
Was about you, actually. And it's really absolutely bizarre. So you were wearing a fire retardant suit and somebody set you on fire. And everybody then crowded around you and started singing The Roof is. And I don't know how long I dreamt that. And it just kept going round and round in a loop. And I very rarely dream. Well, I do dream, obviously, but I don't remember them. And I woke up this morning, I was like, oh my God, what was that?
And while I was in school, because I went to school in the West Midlands, I was frequently called Ruth, and people did used to, in fact, chant the roof, the roof, the roof's on fire. Please don't set me on fire. I'm not keen on that
I'm
at
not going to
all.
set you on fire.
It's yeah. Oh man, there's so many messages. I'm gonna try and whiz through them.
Oh, for a sec.
Um, so you went further to what we were saying earlier. I said, is it worth trying to have a conversation with your GP around it? He does feel that I'm going to use he just based on your name. I'm sorry if you're there. Might have an advantage because they work in the NHS with a specialist in autism. What do you think? Do you think a GP would maybe listen a bit more?
Mm, don't know. Depends on the GP, doesn't it? That's the thing.
Mm. Yes, yes,
Really, really does. I mean,
absolutely.
there's some GPs are amazing, absolutely amazing, are open to all sorts of things.
Yes,
I think if you're one of these people that are lucky enough to have had the same GP for a long time and built a relationship with them, which is something that doesn't tend to happen anymore, I think they're probably more likely to be open to all sorts of different things and conversations. But it's pot luck for most people what GP they even see, isn't it? It could be a
yeah,
complete stranger. So yeah,
yeah, yeah.
really,
You
really,
might have to
really.
see who you got. And remember, if you've got the spoons, you can always, I mean, you know this, if you work in the NHS, you can always ask for second opinions, you can always shop around, see different people, keep asking for different specialists.
That's the thing.
If you've got the energy to do it,
Even in like if you're in local Facebook groups and stuff, other people might have had good experiences with a specific GP, and you may
yeah,
be able to see that GP. You might have 20 different GPs in one single practice. That's
yeah,
20 experiences, and it's always going to be kind of unique. But I'm not saying right off the NHS. That's not what I'm
no,
saying. But what I'm saying is our expectations of what we're going to get from it are often not matched by what we do get from it. And what
Yeah,
we do get from it more often than not actually just causes more harm and delivers more trauma.
yeah, yeah. Emma is saying peer support is great, but I need actual people around. I put a lot in place for myself, but by tribunal complaints, racial abuse, and ableist abuse is pushing me to the edge. Man, honestly, a commune is also on my list of stuff that I would absolutely love to create. That I would just get a massive amount of space somewhere lovely and just invite everybody to come and live with me for free. But I'm also morally opposed to billionaires, so I'm not quite sure how I would do that. But all jokes, like honestly, yes, I feel it deep in my soul. I wish that there was more physical people where we could just physically look after each other when
Yeah.
we needed it.
Yeah.
Just go into each other's houses and go, do you know what? You look exhausted, have some, I'll cook you dinner. Oh man, I can see that you just need your vacuum whizzing round. I've got the spoons to do it today, so I'll do it for you today. And then when I'm on my knees next week, you come and do it for me. Yes, yes, that 100% agree that
Long
that's
as
what we need.
as long as in that commune we all have our own plots and security fences around.
Oh, like we all have our own houses, as far as I'm concerned, with quite a bit of space around each one, but we can go and see each other when we want to,
Yeah.
just within walking distance. Yeah. With stress burnout, what might you suggest when you have little control of the triggers, e.g., the sensory triggers of the pitch and volume of little people in the house when dysregulated? This we've touched upon a few times, haven't we? But I think it's really important to keep coming back to.
It is, and that's big stuff from little people that has a big impact. And sometimes, as a parent, you can't get away from that. That's absolutely something you cannot really get away from any extended period. But any teeny tiny thing that you can do to even get a minute's space away from it. So that might be wearing noise cancelling headphones and playing some music. It might be literally sticking your head out the bathroom window. It might be locking yourself in a cupboard for 10 minutes or screaming into a pillow, like whatever is going to kind of pull you away from that to just to get a little bit of respite. And I would say from Littleys, having been there with three of them, they grow
Mm,
a bit older and it does pass. It really, really does pass. Um, but there's also has to be an element of modeling going on there as well in
yeah,
terms of it is okay for you to say you're having a negative or in child version you're having a negative impact on me, so what are we going to do about this kind of thing? It's that isn't always easy to do, and it very much depends on the child and where they're at in terms of their ability to kind of cognitively kind of reason with that. But if you start modeling that and say actually you're hurting mum or you're hurting dad, and I've had to do it with my kids, it's kind of,
mm,
I really am hugely touch averse, and my kids love hugs and cuddles. So I have to grin and bear it. But there comes a point where I'm like, no, you have to back off now. Like, it's too much. Step back. And that's okay to do. That's boundaries. And, if we model boundaries with our children and allow our children to have boundaries with us, then, we all get to a place where we can compromise much better.
yeah,
So it's not easy to kind of resolve that in the moment. Things like distraction techniques for them and stuff like that. Often I end up, but we haven't have sock fights where I just get all the socks out of the laundry that hasn't been put away and roll them up, and we just start pelting each other. It's like a spontaneous thing that happens that just distracts them, and then it's okay. It's a sensory break, and they'll go back to doing their thing, which is usually much quieter after something like that. So
mm,
little things depending on your context, but those little things you can take control in some ways, even if it's just for 10 seconds. You can take
yeah,
some ways. So again, that's like with the expectations of the NHS, the expectations that we have don't always match up with the reality of our situations, or our wants don't match up with our needs. So, you know, make it small and then we can start expanding it in some ways.
yeah. I find it helpful in those kind of things to kind of think of my whole sensory self. So if one sense is really struggling, sometimes it can be helpful to reduce all the other senses. So walk around the house with sunglasses on when the kids are making loud noises. Make sure you're wearing really, really comfortable clothes, that kind of thing. And sometimes it helps to give another sense a really big boost, so you've got something to focus on. So sometimes if my kids are being really loud, I actually put really loud music on and then dance loads, because actually it kind of just it's about like with the sock fights, it's about changing the energy around it.
Or something
That
like
if
that.
your
That's
energy is
correct.
ah,
What you
yeah,
just
sorry,
described
say
then,
that again.
perfect co-regulating, whereby you're getting a sensory input, they're getting a sensory input, and you're actually doing the same things, but you're
Yeah,
doing it in your own way, meeting your own needs, and that's kind of really key. And that's why I said about things like sticking your head out the window, because that's a
yeah,
sensory change. There's an environmental shift there where the wind might be blowing, the air's temperature's a little bit different. Stepping outside your front door for 30 seconds, that can
yeah,
help reset you and re-regulate you. So yeah, it's really good advice that kind of either match the rhythm and flow or completely reduce everything else.
yeah,
That's
yeah. And I find it changes on the day as to what is better at that time. But if you build up a little toolkit, an imaginary toolkit, these are the things that I can call upon. Give a couple of them a try and see
doesn't even,
which one works today.
doesn't even need to be imaginary. You can literally list it and stick it on the fridge to
Yeah,
remind yourself. You have a go-to place where what can I do right now because I'm feeling stressed, and there's your list of things that you can do. Write that list when you're feeling calm, not when you're
yeah.
feeling stressed. Because otherwise that's where we get back to the dependency and the alcohol and the things like that.
Yeah,
You're calm,
yeah,
right? Stick it somewhere where you can go to. If you can remember that, then there's your list of tools that you can use right now to help yourself.
yeah. So someone in my family has got an ongoing, very stressful situation that there isn't an easy way out of. And they were saying that they're actually the thing they found most helpful is smashing stuff. But the trouble with that is that they're a grown up, so they smash stuff and then they just have to clean it all up again. And it's really like the smashing stuff is nice, and now I just have to sweep all this stuff and be responsible and probably replace it all. Yeah, it's think about the things when you're calm, so maybe you don't have to smash
You're
stuff.
privileged enough to have a yard or a garden. I'd make a little zone in the yard or
Do
garden
a
where
little smash
you
zone.
go to the charity shop and get some crockery for pennies that's ready to have it all set up out there, and you can just go out and take a hammer to it or fling it
Yeah,
around or whatever.
got rage rooms now, haven't they? I don't know how many there are, but they exist. Places that you can go where you smash stuff up, and then other people will clean it up
Yeah,
afterwards.
axe throwing and stuff like that as well.
Oh yeah, axe throwing.
I'd love to do that.
Yeah, and on that note, I was watching something the other day that there was some theories that neurodivergent people may have been more likely to be the hunters than the gatherers in
Mhm.
hunter-gatherer society, and that actually we tend to have better aim. I have got rubbish aim, but I think that that's probably down to my eyesight more than my innate skills. I'm currently wearing glasses, aren't quite powerful enough for me, but that's a whole other thing. Let's come back to the comments before I'm allowed to stick stickers in my hair before I'm allowed to go off on another tangent. One of the biggest things that causes me stress is injustice. Oh, Eliza. I
Mhm.
find it really hard to cope with, and I can't let things go. Yeah, and everybody in the comments is saying the same. It seems to be de rigueur for us, doesn't it? That just, yeah, autistic people are driven by um, a sense of values, and things that go against our values it can be really challenging. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely a motivational drive for change, I would say, in a resistance to things that we deem to be unhealthy. And I think
yeah,
be careful there because we can't generalize for everybody, and there are plenty of autistic people who very much aren't socially motivated. They're kind of internally driven, and
yes,
tend to find those people in positions of power. Unfortunately,
right,
but yeah, I think it's sometimes it traps you, doesn't it? That kind of there are times where I can't watch the news.
no, yeah,
So overwhelming and awful, and it really does, it can trap you in that state and become a real negative state to kind of be in. But the
yes,
flip side is, like I've literally made social justice my job.
yeah,
That so it's and you too, Ruth, in terms of a lot
yeah,
of what you do, so if you can think about that real aversion to injustice, and you can direct that in a useful and productive way, in a constructive way for you, then that's really empowering.
Yeah, yeah. And I think once you step into the space as well, you recognize that even if you're concentrating on apparently one particular element of marginalized or oppressed peoples, actually you will always have massive intersections. And if you are working to help free and unmarginalize anybody, actually you're helping to free and unmarginalize everybody because you can't do it a bit at a time.
No,
Um, yeah, I did just want to highlight the reason that I say values driven rather than justice driven is because for some autistic people, those values are actually very counter to what we would view as justice, and some autistic people are pulled into very insular and self-involved spaces. I think there's a disproportionate amount of autistic people in Nazi movements and things again, trigger warning, and things like that
movements
because
and
it's
things like that.
values, not justice.
Yeah.
So it can be. I think I know sometimes it's really frustrating for autistic people. I've come across autistic people say, "Well, we can't be racist because we're so driven by justice," and that is
No.
definitely not true.
And you can be driven by justice and still be racist as well.
Oh, absolutely. Because yeah, yeah, we're getting distracted again.
But
But yeah, values driven rather than justice driven. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Emma. Kelly Mailer's work on interception, I've heard a few people say, is really, really helpful. Um,
I am doing
oh,
trainings with Kelly Mailer in the next few months. They're not public news, so don't tell anyone. Not yet. It's not been promoted yet, but it's secret. So one's on intraception and monotropism, and the other one is on interception and masking.
excellent. Oh, well, those would be fantastic. Well, everybody look out for those. Sound fantastic. While we're talking about burnout quite a bit, which obviously we touched on quite a lot tonight, do have a look at David and Tanya's seminar that they did for us on the kind of what it was about was like the alternate discussions around burnout. Basically, that when you get into burnout and you carry on anyway, which so many of us do, and what burnout can turn into. So do have a look at that because that's a resource and free for all of you, obviously. Yeah, Kiana, my husband died 12 years ago and I still grieve. I just don't see how you can't.
No,
I, I just don't see how you can't. Yeah.
and I don't.
Um,
It's anybody else's right to decide whether you have grieved for too long or not long enough, or you're grieving in the right way or the wrong way, or that's not anybody else's decision to make.
no.
That's for you to kind of navigate, and people experiencing that should get support. They shouldn't get pathologized. Those two things are very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, smash rooms are great. Used to do youth work and saw some colleagues who used to set them up. Fantastic. If any of you have links to where smash rooms are, please feel free to share them because I don't know that I've actually I've come across the theory of them, but I haven't come across actually where they are. Like to smash, I've learned to smash things up in the sink so it's easier to clean up afterwards. Very wise, very wise. Oh, thank you. Emma's already shared links on there, so if you're interested in smash rooms, Emma's got some links on there. No, this is an interesting one. I am aware of the time. I might have to do this as the last question. I'm really sorry, everybody. I will have to flick through the last one. Zoe has said, "What are your opinions on screens? Are they positive or negative coping mechanisms, or is it not as cut and dry?"
Yeah, well, if you read the news, it will tell you that screens are awful things and we must get our children off of them. And most people read the news on screens now, don't they? So
I know, right?
ironic that these people that are hypercritical about screen time are writing stuff that's read on screens. I just find that so amusing. Um, it's nowhere near as cut and dry in that. Nothing's ever that cut and dry. And we are exposed to superficial narratives all the time. So I would argue that there is a reason that neurodivergent people came up with computers and screens, and all the things that go behind them. Why? Because they meet the needs of neurodivergent people, lots of different types of neurodivergent people, a lot of the time. So there is a reason that neurodivergent people are often drawn to screens as a way of kind of escaping the world that's going on around them, because it's about things that you can control, things that match your cognitive function and the way that your brain works. It's around, those dopamine hits and things like that as well. Um, but also they're enormously amazing learning tools. And actually, I have no limits on screen time with my children at all. And my children are doing all sorts of incredible things that had they, well, two of them, one of them is still at school and two of them aren't. Um, they're doing incredible things and have learned incredible things that they would not have learned to be able to do at school because they wouldn't have had the time to focus on those things.
Mm.
So we have to be cautious around this. Now, if someone is, um, using the screen as a kind of a coping thing. If that's a distraction from what's going on in their life, my solution to that is not take the screen away, because that's their coping mechanism. That's their way of I'm in a space where I can exert some control over what's going on in my life.
Mm.
Safety thing. So if you remove that safety feature, then what are you saying to that person? Well, you're not allowed any autonomy or agency at all. So if someone is using a screen in what might be deemed from a parental perspective in a kind of a problematic way, usually I would frame it through that lens of actually it's a safety mechanism, then that's where you start looking to what's causing them to feel unsafe. So you don't focus on the screen as the problem. You focus on the screen as an indicator that there are other things going on around that child that they feel unsafe about. They might be traumatized, and they might be going to school every day and having a really negative experience, even though they might be coming home with a smile on their face. They might be dysregulated. They might not understand themselves very well. They might be feeling disconnected or lonely or isolated. All of those things can be going on, and you, even as a parent, we don't always see those things. So, and some things are very obvious and right in our face, and we just don't recognize the amount of parents that I see kind of, my child's melting down in ferocious ways and quite violent ways. And what can we do about that? And then when you dig into it, well, they're at school every day and they mask furiously. There's the problem. The problem isn't that they're melting down. The problem is they're responding to something else. Um, so it's finding out what it's in a response to. So the other thing with screens as well is that when you socialize through a game or through, through a mechanism like a screen, things like that, it takes a lot of the socialization pressure away from you, because you're not having to think about where your body posture is, whether you're making eye contact, whether you're doing whatever it is that you do in a physical kind of socialization space. So actually it can become a lot easier to maintain and manage friendships in those spaces as well. So again, if you remove that screen from someone, you're actually taking their social connections away from them as well. So yeah, so I would look at it through a reframed lens.
Yeah, which was what we were saying earlier with the other ones as well, wasn't it? That if you're a skin picker and you notice that you're suddenly picking your hand dry, that is yourself trying to tell yourself there's something to be stressed about here. If you enjoy screens, but you realise that actually you're using them so that you don't have to talk to anybody else in your life, that's yourself telling yourself what's going on in my life that I'm trying to escape from. Andy from Spectrum Gaming talks about the same with our kids. Of if you think that your kids are using screens as a coping mechanism, it isn't about taking the screen away. It's about improving everything else so that they don't have to only be on screens. It's about what in your life is meaning you cannot cope with anything else. As soon as you get home, you're just on the screens every hour that you're conscious. How do we make everything else in your life nicer so that you don't necessarily have to do that?
I think as
Yeah.
well, I think there's an element here. I was literally talking to a parent about this today. They were talking about rejection sensitivity and the struggles that they were having, the dynamic between them and their teenage daughter. And I said, I'm not a great fan of that narrative, particularly when it comes to kind of relational narratives. I said, because if you've got a 14-year-old autistic child, you've also got a teenager. They're a
Mm.
human being going through lots of things. So there are going to be times when you, despite being the safest person on the planet for them, are also the most antagonistic person on the planet for them for various different reasons. So when you are feeling that level of rejection from your child, then I'm getting to a point here with this.
It's okay.
That when you're feeling that level of rejection from your child, then it's more about you than it is about them. It's about how you're responding to it, what your wants and needs are, and within that space. And it's the same thing with things like how we perceive certain things as well. So when we see a child on a screen for a long period of time, our brain automatically goes to what we're conditioned to think. We
Mhm.
use something called heuristics to take shortcuts to our biases in our brains. And what we're conditioned to think is that a child that is on a screen is playing a game which is not worthwhile, and therefore they shouldn't be on it, or they're watching a video which is not worthwhile. Why? Because they should be climbing trees, they should be reading a book, they should be doing this, they should be doing that, they should be out chasing other children around, or whatever. But we know that we have a group of children here who develop in a very different way, so have very different social motivations, very different needs, exist in a very different way. So why are we applying normative ideals onto children who don't exist normatively?
Yeah,
And it's that kind of, so we have to, so why I used the kind of the RSD narrative was, we have to think about, well, hold on a minute, how much of this is societal conditioning that I'm just
yeah,
regurgitating here without really understanding what my child wants and needs? Because that might be very different to what we think. So
yeah,
reframing that is really, really, and that's a home ed narrative in terms of, actually home ed is not school at home. Home ed
yeah,
is a whole other universe of many,
yeah,
many different things. So we have to uncondition ourselves and unschool ourselves, and we have to take these normative narratives and try our best to rip them up and just think about, right now, if my child is healthy and happy, that's a really good thing. If they're safe, that's a good thing. If they're using screens for social context and learning and things like that, that's a great thing. If they're using screens as a coping mechanism and as a way to avoid things, what are they avoiding, and how do we prevent those things from
yeah,
impacting on them?
yeah,
That's a much healthier way of looking at our kids and thinking about them developmentally and socially and things, and you will grow up with a much healthier and happy child than if you rip the screen away and tell them to go out and play.
yeah. One thing I found really powerful was a discussion that highlighted that for like my parents' generation, so
Mhm.
around the 1960s ish, children reading was seen as massively negative, and there were huge amounts of social discussions about how children shouldn't be sitting inside reading books; they should be outside climbing trees, and that reading books was enormously negative for them, and it would rot their brains, and it would give them all kinds of ideas, and it would cause them to be pale and wastely and, shrink away. Like, it really highlighted for me, oh my goodness, this is just the thing that this generation of parents always looks down on this generation of parents,
Sure.
and it's up to us to stop that and to recognize that and to say, actually, it will always change generation on generation, and that's really healthy. It should change generation on generation. We should recognize the things that our parents did that was great, let's try and do more of that, and the things that our parents did that was not so great, let's do less of that. I am not expecting my children, if they ever decide to have children themselves, to parent like me. I'm expecting them to do it better. Because
Our
I
job is
because
our job is to make mistakes that our children learn from. And unfortunately, some of that might be traumatizing. We are going to traumatize our kids.
yeah,
That's a given. That's always going to happen. And our role is to kind of mitigate that as best we can and reflect on, actually, well, what did the previous generation do, or what did our parents do that we don't want to repeat?
yeah,
What We have to be careful of not to oversteer and go completely the opposite way, because sometimes that can create more problems as well. But balance is the key to all of this. It's like, the narratives around eating, balance, narratives around dieting, balance. It's all
yeah,
balance. And and as long as our kids are healthy and happy, I think that's the most important thing. We should be a
mm,
safe first kind of lens that we put on them. And we often don't. It's usually other people's wants and needs and expectations that we look at first, rather than, actually, is my child safe and okay? And
yeah,
yeah, and I think one last thing on this as well from me is, we exist in a world now which is very computer and screen driven. That's schools talk all the time about getting children ready for the real world. And well, the real world is that they're probably going to be most likely using a screen within their role. So we
Yeah.
want children that are extremely computer literate and able to use technology. And then we punish them for doing so.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bonkers, isn't it? Yeah,
It's
that's it.
absolutely bonkers.
But you do. I have to give credit. So my number three is massively hypermobile, and I've been really struggling to teach him to write. And actually, it was an occupational therapist that just said, just don't. It
Yeah,
hurts his hands. You can
yeah,
use all kinds of adjustments and different attachments and different shaped pens, but it all hurts his hands. Just teach him to type.
yeah,
Actually, he's probably never going to really need to write. And
no.
if you think about your day to day life now, I actually quite like writing. I constantly have notes on the go
That's
that I'm
what you
writing stuff
brought
in,
up
but I don't
to
have
as well,
to.
though, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just because I actually, I like the sensation of pen on paper. I like a good pen. You know, when it runs over the page really well, that's very pleasant for me. That's all the nice tingles. Um, but that's me thing, right? He doesn't actually need that. And it was nice to have that reframe of like, why are you trying to force something that he doesn't actually need,
Yeah,
and he can do without? He needs to spell, but he doesn't need to write. That was really helpful. Yeah, yeah, super. I know there's been more comments come in, but I also know that we've already overrun by half an hour and that Kieran is sick. So I'm gonna finish up there. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for coming, Kieran, as ever. Thank you so much for everything you share with us. Thank you for everybody in the comments. You've been absolutely brilliant.